Package org.parosproxy.paros.model. Import java.sql.sql exception. Import java.utility iterator. Import java.utility sort dset. Import java.utility string tokenizer. Import javax.swing.tree.default tree model. Import javax.swing.tree.tree node. Import org.apache.commons.client.uri. Import org.apache.commons.client.uri exception. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.http malformed header exception. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.http message. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.http request header. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.http status code. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class sitemap extends default tree model. Private model equals null. Public static sitemap create tree, model. Site node root equals new site node, sites. Return new sitemap, root, model. Public sitemap, site node root, model. Super, root. This .model equals model. Return the HTTP message of the same type under the tree path. At param message. At return null equals not found. Public synchronized HTTP message poll path, HTTP message. Site node result node equals null. URI equals message get request header, .get URI. String scheme equals null. String host equals null. String path equals null. Int port equals 80. Site node parent equals, site node, get root. String tokenizer equals null. String folder equals try. Scheme equals URI.get scheme. Host equals scheme plus URI.get host. Port equals URI.get port. If port equals -1. Host equals host plus port. No host yet. Parent equals find child, parent, host. If parent equals null. Return null. Path equals URI.get path. If path equals null. Path equals tokenizer equals new string tokenizer, path. While tokenizer.hasMar tokens. Folder equals tokenizer.next token. If folder equals null and folder equals. If tokenizer.count tokens equals 0. String leaf name equals get leaf name, folder, message. Result node equals find child, parent, leaf name. Else parent equals find child, parent, folder. If parent equals null. Return null. Catch, URI exception e.print stack trace. If result node equals null. Return null. HTTP message node message equals null. Try. Node message equals result node.getHistory reference, .getP message. Catch, exception Return node message. Add the history reference into the sitemap. This method will rely on reading message from the history table. At param ref. Public synchronized void add path, history reference ref. HTTP message equals null. Try. Message equals ref.getP message. Catch, exception e.print stack trace. Return. Add path, ref, message. Add the history reference with the corresponding HTTP message into the sitemap. This method saves the message to be read from the reference table. Use this method if the HTTP message is known. At param message. At return. Public synchronized void add path, history reference ref, HTTP message. URI equals message get request header, .get URI. String scheme equals null. String host equals null. String path equals null. Int port equals 80. Site node parent equals, site node, get root. String tokenizer equals null. String folder equals try. Scheme equals URI.get scheme. Host equals scheme plus URI.get host. Port equals URI.get port. If port equals -1. Host equals host plus port. Add host. Parent equals find and add child, parent, host, ref, message. Path equals URI.get path. If path equals null. Path equals tokenizer equals new string tokenizer, path. While tokenizer.has mar tokens. Folder equals tokenizer.next token. If folder equals null and folder dot equals. If tokenizer.count tokens equals 0. Leaf path name. Find and data leaf, parent, folder, ref, message. Else parent equals find and add child, parent, folder, ref, message. Catch, exception e.print stack trace. Private site node find and add child, site node parent, string node name, history reference base ref, http message base message, throws URI exception, http malformed header exception, null pointer exception, SQL exception. Site node result equals find child, parent, node name. If result equals null. Site node new node equals new site node, node name. Int POS equals parent.getChild count. 4. Int I equals 0, I parent.getChild count, I++. If node name.compare2, parent.getChild at, I, .toString, 0. POS equals I. Break. Insert node into, new node, parent, POS. Result equals new node. Result.thisther reference, create reference, result, base ref, base message. Return result. Private site node find child, site node parent, string node name. 4. Int I equals 0, I parent.getChild count, I++. Site node child equals, site node, parent.getChild at, I. If child.toString, equals, node name. Return child. Return null. Private site node find and data leaf, site node parent, string node name, history reference ref, http message. String leaf name equals get leaf name, node name, message. Site node equals find child, parent, leaf name. If node equals null. Node equals new site node, leaf name. Node.thisther reference, ref. Int POS equals parent.getChild count. 4. Int I equals 0, I parent.getChild count, I++. If leaf name.compare2, parent.getChild at, I, .toString, 0. POS equals I. Break. Insert node into, node, parent, POS. Else. Do not replace if. Use local copy, 304. Only use if 200. If, message get response header, .get status code, equals http status code.ok. Replace node history reference to this new child if this is a spidered record. Node.thisther reference, ref. Ref.setSiteNode, node. Else. Node.getPosThisther reference, .add, ref. Ref.setSiteNode, node. Return node. Private string get leaf name, string node name, http message. Add \u007f to make get post node appear at the end. String leaf name equals \u007f plus message get request header, .get method, plus colon plus node name. String leaf name equals message get request header, dot get method, plus colon plus node name. String query equals try. Query equals message get request header, dot get URI, dot get query. Catch, URI exception dot print stack trace. If, query equals null. Query equals leaf name plus get param ramstring, message get param name set, query. Also handle post method query in body. Query equals if, message get request header, dot get method, dot equal signer recase, http request header dot post. Query equals message get request body, dot tossed ring. Leaf name plus get param string, message get param name set, query. Return leaf name. Private string get param string, sort dset query set. String buffer sb equals new string buffer. Iterator equals query set dot iterator. 4. Int I equals 0, iterator dot has next, I plus plus. String name equals, string, iterator dot next. If, name equals null. Continue. If, I0. SB append, name. String result equals. If, SB length, 0. Result equals, plus SB tossed ring, plus. Return result. Private history reference create reference, site node, history reference base ref, HTTP message base, throws HTTP malformed header exception, SQL exception, URI exception, null pointer exception. Tree node path equals node dot get path. String buffer SB equals new string buffer. 4. Int I equals 1, I path dot length, I plus plus. SB append, path I dot tossed ring. If, I path dot length 1. SB append. HTTP message new message equals base dot clone request. URI equals new URI, SB tossed ring, true. New message dot get request header, dot set URI. New message dot get request header, dot set method, HTTP request header dot get. New message dot get request body, dot set body. New message dot get request header, dot set content length, 0. History reference history ref equals new history reference, model dot gets as Zion, base ref dot get history right type, new message. History reference history ref equals new history reference, model dot gets as Zion, history reference dot type underscore temporary, new message. Return history ref. Package org.paros proxy.paros.view. Import java.awt.card layout. Import java.awt.event queue. Import java.awt.event.input event. Import javax.swing.jpanel. Import javax.swing.jscrollpane. Import javax.swing.jtree. Import javax.swing.tree.tree node. Import javax.swing.tree.tree path. Import org.parosproxy.paros.model.site node. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.http message. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class sitemap panel extends jpanel. Private jscrollpane equals null. Private jtree site equals null. Private tree path rootreepathy equals null. Private view equals null. This is the default constructor. Public sitemap panel. Super. Initialize. Private view get view. If view equals null. View equals view dot gets Ingleton. Return view. This method initializes this. At return void. Private void initialize. This dot set layout, new card layout. This dot set size, 300,200. This dot add, get jscroll pane, get jscroll pane, dot get name. Expand root. This method initializes jscroll pane. At return javax.swing.jscroll pane. Private jscroll pane get jscroll pane. If jscroll pane equals null. JScroll pane equals new JScroll pane. JScroll pane dot set viewport view, get tree site. JScroll pane dot set preferred size, new java.awt.dimension, 200,400. JScroll pane dot set name, JScroll pane. Return JScroll pane. This method initializes tree site. At return javax.swing.jtree. Public jtree get tree site. If tree site equals null. Tree site equals new jtree. Tree site dot set shows ruthendals, true. Tree site dot set name, tree site. Tree site dot set equal click count, 1. Tree site dot add listener, new java.awt.event.mouse adapter. Public void mouse pressed, java.awt.event.mouse event e. If e.get modifiers, and input event.button 3_mask, equals 0, right mouse button. View.get singleton, .get pop-up menu, .show, e.get component, e.get x, e.get y. Tree site.add tree selection listener, new javax.swing.event.tree selection listener. Public void value changed, javax.swing.event.tree selection event e. HTTP message equals null. Site node equals, site node, tree site.get last selected path component. If node equals null. Return. If node.is root. Try. Message equals node.get history reference, .get p message. Catch, exception e1. Return. HTTP panel req panel equals get view, .get request panel. HTTP panel res panel equals get view, .get response panel. req panel .set message, message, true. Res panel .set message, message, false. Return tree site. Public void expand root. Tree node root equals, tree node, tree site.get model, .get root. If rootrepathy equals null root, equals rootrepathy.get path component, 0. Rootrepathy equals new tree path, root. If event q.is dispatch thread. Get tree site, .expand path, rootrepathy. Return. Try. Event q.invoke later, new runnable. Public void run. Get tree site, .expand path, rootrepathy. Catch, exception e. Package org.paros proxy.paros.model. Import java.utility vector. Import javax.swing.tree.default mutable tree node. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class site node extends default mutable tree node. Private string node name equals null. Private history reference equals null. Private vector paths history equals new vector, 10. Public site node, string node name. Super. This node name equals node name. Public string tossed ring. Return node name. Public history reference get history reference. Return history reference. Set current node reference. If there is any existing reference, delete if spider record. Otherwise, put into past history list. At param history reference. Public voids history reference, history reference. If get history reference equals null. If getHistoryReference dot getHistoryType equals history reference dot type underscore spider. getHistoryReference dot delete. getHistoryReference dot set cytonode null. Else if getPosHistoryReference dot contains history reference. getPosHistoryReference dot add getHistoryReference. Above code commented as to always add all into past reference. For use in scanner. If getPosHistoryReference dot contains history reference. getPosHistoryReference dot add getHistoryReference. This dot history reference equals history reference. This dot history reference dot set cytonode this. Public vector getPosHistoryReference. Return PasHistoryList. Package org.parosproxy.paros.core.spider. Import java.sql.sql exception. Import java.utility hash set. Import java.utility tree set. Import java.utility vector. Import org.apache.commons.client.uri. Import org.apache.commons.client.uri exception. Import org.apache.commons.logging.log. Import org.apache.commons.logging.log factory. Import org.parosproxy.paros.model.history reference. Import org.parosproxy.paros.model.model. Import org.parosproxy.paros.model.session. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.connection_param. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.http malformed header exception. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.http message. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.http request header. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.http sender. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class spider. Private static log equals log factory.get log, spider.class. Private HTTP sender equals null. Private boolean isSubmit form equals true. Private vector listener list equals new vector. Private connection param equals null. Private vector queue equals new vector. Private spider thread equals null. Private spider param equals null. Private hash set seed host namizet equals new hash set. Private int depth queue count equals null. Private session equals null. Private model equals null. Private boolean isStop equals false. Private tree set visitAget method equals null. Private tree set QGet method equals null. Private vector visited post method equals new vector. Public spider param, connection param, model. This dot connection param equals param. This dot spider param equals spider param. This dot model equals model. This dot session equals model dot get session. Spider thread equals new spider thread spider param dot get thread. Depth queue count equals new int spider param dot get max depth +1. visitAget method equals new tree set. QGet method equals new tree set. Public void add spider listener listener. Listener list dot add listener. Public void add seed URI. HTTP message. Try. Message equals new HTTP message URI. Add seed message. Catch HTTP malformed header exception e.print stack trace. Public synchronized void add seed HTTP message. URI equals message get request header dot get URI. String host name equals null. Int port equals 80. Try. Log.info, seeding plus message get request header, .get URI, .toast ring. Host name equals URI .get host. Port equals URI .get port. If, port 0. Host name equals host name plus colon plus integer .toast ring, port. Seed host name is at .add, host name. Add q, message, 0. Catch, URI exception e.print stack trace. Public boolean add q, http message, int depth. Q item equals null. If, depth spider param.get max depth, ISIN visited link, message. Return false. Synchronized, q. Try. No need to add if in queue already. Comment code to use db directly. 4. Int I equals 0, iq.size, and, is stop, I++. Item equals, q item, q.get, I. If, item.get message, equals, message. Return. If, is queued, message. Return false. Item equals new q item, session, history reference type underscore spider underscore seed, message. Catch, exception Return false. Item set depth, depth. If, q.size, 0. Add to queue according to depth. 4. Int I equals q.size, 1, I equals 0, I. Q item poll equals, q item, q.get, I. If, item.get depth, equals poll.get depth. If, I plus 1 equals q.size, 1. q.add, I plus 1, item. Break. Else. q.add, item. Break. Else if, I equals 0. q.add, 0, item. Break. Else. q.add, item. If, depth q count length. Depth q count depth plus. If, q.size, %50 equals 0. q.trim toe size. Return true. Void checkable thread completed. 4. Int I equals 0, I spider thread length, I++. If, spider thread I is completed. Cannot check thread alive here because child issued this check. They will not stop yet. Return. All thread finished running. Notify listener spider complete. At return returns the HTTP sender. Public HTTP sender get sender. Return HTTP sender. At return returns the queue. Public vector get queue. Return queue. Private void notify listener foundry, HTTP message, boolean is skip. Spider listener equals null. 4. Int I equals 0, I listener list.size, I++. Listener equals, spider listener list.get, I. Listener.found URI, message, is skip. Private void notify listener spider complete. Spider listener equals null. Notify listener spider progress, null, 100. 4. Int I equals 0, I listener list.size, I++. Listener equals, spider listener list.get, I. Listener.spider complete. Log.info, spider completed. Get sender, shutdown. Is stop equals true. Synchronized void spider progress, q item. Int scale equals 100, spider param.get max depth, plus 1. Int percentage equals scale item.get depth. Int outstanding equals 0. 4. Int I equals 0, iq.size, I++. Q item poll equals, q item, q.get, I. If, poll, equals null. If, poll.get depth, equals item.get depth. Outstanding plus plus. Percentage plus equals scale, depth queue count item dot get depth, outstanding, depth queue count item dot get depth. Try. Nota listener spider progress, item dot get message, dot get request header, dot get URI, percentage. Thread dot sleep, 100. Catch, exception E. Private void nota listener spider progress, URI, int percentage complete. Spider listener equals null. 4, int I equals 0, I listener list dot size, I plus plus. Listener equals, spider listener list dot get, I. Listener dot spider progress, URI, percentage complete, visited post method dot size, plus visited jet method dot size, q dot size. Private void nota listener registry, HTTP message. Spider listener equals null. Log.info, crawled plus message get request header, dot get URI, dot tossed ring. 4, int I equals 0, I listener list dot size, I plus plus. Listener equals, spider listener list dot get, I. Listener dot read URI, message. Public void remove spider listener listener. Listener list dot remove, listener. At return returns the spider param. Public spider param get spider param. Return spider param. At param the spider param to set. Public void set spider param, spider param. This dot spider param equals spider param. Public void start. Log.info, spider started. Is stop equals false. HTTP sender equals new HTTP sender, connection param, true. HTTP sender dot set follow direct, true. 4, int I equals 0, I spider thread dot length, I plus plus. If, spider thread I, equals null and spider thread I dot is alive. Spider thread I dot set stop, true. Spider thread I equals new spider thread, this. Spider thread I dot start. Public void stop. Geth sender, dot shutdown. 4, int I equals 0, I spider thread dot length, I plus plus. Spider thread I dot set stop, true. Try. Spider thread I dot join, 2000. Catch, interrupted exception E. Log.info, spider stopped. Is stop equals true. Public boolean e seed scope, URI. Boolean result equals false. String host name equals null. Try. Host name equals URI.get host. If, URI.get port, 0. Host name equals host name plus colon plus URI.get port. String host list equals, string, seed host namizet.to array, new string 0. 4, int I equals 0, I host list dot length, I plus plus. If, host list I equals null, continue. If, host name dot ends with, host list I. Return true. Catch, URI exception E. E.print stack trace. Return false. Void found URI, HTTP message, int current depth. Try. If, is neglect found, message. Treat even post as get to avoid duplicate. Message get request header, dot set method, HTTP request header dot get. If, ISN visited link, message. Nota listener found URI, message, true. Add visited link, message. Else. If, add queue, message, current depth. Nota listener found URI, message, false. Catch, URI exception E. Void read URI, HTTP message. Nota listener registry, message. Boolean ISN visited link, HTTP message. If, message get request header, dot get method, dot equal signer recase, HTTP request header dot get. Return is visita jet method, message. Try. If, model.getDB.gettable history, .contains URI, session.get sessioned, history reference.type _ spider _ visited. Message get request header, .get method, message get request header, .get URI, .tossed ring, message get request body, .tossed ring. Return true. Catch, exception e.print stack trace. Return false. Void add visited link, http message. If, message get request header, .get method, .signor recase, http request header .get. Synchronized, visitajet method. Visitajet method .add, message get request header, .get URI, .tossed ring. Return. Q item equals null. Try. Item equals new Q item, session, history reference .type _ spider _ visited, message. Catch, exception e. Return. Synchronized, visited post method. Visited post method .add, item. Boolean is queued, http message. Try. Return model.getDB.gettable history, .contains URI, session.get sessioned, history reference.type _ spider _ seed. Message get request header, .get method, message get request header, .get URI, .tossed ring, message get request body, .tossed ring. Catch, SQL exception e.print stack trace. Return false. Check buffer before searching for visited link from disk. At param message. At return. Private boolean is visita jet method, http message. String URI equals message get request header, .get URI, .tossed ring. Synchronized, visitajet method. If, visitajet method .contains, URI. Return true. Return false. Check if URL is to be neglected if, not HTTP protocol, outside. Host domain, irrelevant file suffix, e.g. GIF, JPG, visited before. URL queried by this method will be marked visited. At throws URI exception. Private boolean is neglect found, HTTP message, throws URI exception. Boolean result equals false. URI equals message get request header, .get URI. Check correct protocol. If, URI.get scheme, .equal signor recase, HTTP, and, URI.get scheme, .equal signor recase, HTTPS. Return true. Compare if in seeds domain or inside session domain scope. String host name equals URI.get host, .uppercase. If, seed scope, URI. If, get spider param, .isen scope, host name. Return true. Return false. Public boolean is stop. Return is stop. Boolean isal thread empty q. 4, int I equals 0, I spider thread length, I++. If, spider thread I.is empty q. Return false. Return true. Package org.paros proxy.paros.extension.spider. Import java.awt.eventqueue. Import java.awt.frame. Import java.awt.gridbag constraints. Import java.awt.gridbag layout. Import java.awt.headless exception. Import javax.swing.jbutton. Import javax.swing.jlabel. Import javax.swing.jpanel. Import javax.swing.jprogressbar. Import javax.swing.jtree. Import javax.swing.event.tree selection listener. Import org.paros proxy.paros.extension.abstract dialog. Import org.paros proxy.paros.model.site node. Import org.paros proxy.paros.network.http message. Import javax.swing.jscrollpane. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class Spider dialog extends abstract dialog, implements tree selection listener. Private jpanel equals null. Private jlabel text display equals null. Private jbutton btn start equals null. Private jbutton btn stop equals null. Private extension spider extension equals null. Private jprogress bar equals null. Private jlabel tsnumcrawled equals null. Private jlabel tst outstanding crawl equals null. Private jpanel 1 equals null. Private jlabel 3 equals null. Private jlabel 4 equals null. Private jlabel 5 equals null. Private jscrollpane equals null. At throws headless exception. Public spider dialog, throws headless exception. Super. Initialize. At param arg0. At param arg1. At throws headless exception. Public spider dialog, frame arg0, boolean arg1, throws headless exception. Super, arg0, arg1. Initialize. This method initializes this. At return void. Private void initialize. This dot set title, spider. This dot set content pane, get jpanel. This dot set size, 407, 255. This dot add window listener, new java.awt.event.window adapter. Public void window opened, java.awt.event.window event e. Extension.get minutum spider, dot set enabled, false. Extension.get popup mena spider, dot set enabled, false. Public void window closing, java.awt.event.window event e. btn stop.do click. Extension.get view, .get site tree panel, .get tree site, .remove tree selection listener, spider dialog. This. Extension.get minutum spider, .set enabled, true. Extension.get popup mena spider, .set enabled, true. Extension.clear. Pack. This method initializes jpanel. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get jpanel. If jpanel equals null. Grid bag constraints 15 equals new grid bag constraints. Jlabel 5 equals new jlabel. Grid bag constraints 14 equals new grid bag constraints. Grid bag constraints 5 equals new grid bag constraints. Java.awt.gridbagconstraints 13 equals new grid bag constraints. Javax.swing.jlabel 2 equals new jlabel. Java.awt.gridbagconstraints 12 equals new grid bag constraints. Javax.swing.jlabel 1 equals new jlabel. Java.awt.gridbagconstraints 11 equals new grid bag constraints. Java.awt.gridbagconstraints 4 equals new grid bag constraints. Javax.swing.jlabel equals new jlabel. Java.awt.gridbagconstraints 3 equals new grid bag constraints. Java.awt.gridbagconstraints 2 equals new grid bag constraints. Jpanel equals new jpanel. Jpanel.set layout, new grid bag layout. Grid bag constraints 2.gridx equals 1. Grid bag constraints 2.grid equals 5. Grid bag constraints 2.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Grid bag constraints 2. Anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.east. Grid bag constraints 3. Gridx equals 2. Grid bag constraints 3. Grid equals 5. Grid bag constraints 3. Insets equals new java.awt.insets 2, 2, 2, 10. Grid bag constraints 3. Anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.east. JLabel.set text, HTML body p. The side folder URL chosen will be crawled. You may press stop and resume the crawl afterwards. The spider will crawl hyperlinks and attempt to submit forms p. body HTML. JLabel.set preferred size, new java.awt.dimension, 400,48. JLabel.set minimum size, new java.awt.dimension, 400,48. Grid bag constraints 4. Anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.west. Grid bag constraints 4. Gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 4. Grid equals 4. Grid bag constraints 4. Fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 4. Weights equals 1.0d. Grid bag constraints 4. Insets equals new java.awt.insets 2, 10, 2, 10. Grid bag constraints 4. Grid width equals 3. Grid bag constraints 4. IPADI equals 10. Grid bag constraints 11. Anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 11. Fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 11. Gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 11. Grid equals 3. Grid bag constraints 11. Insets equals new java.awt.insets 2. Comma 10, 8, 10. Grid bag constraints 11. Grid width equals 3. JLabel 1. Set text, URL crawling. Grid bag constraints 12. Anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 12. Fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.none. Grid bag constraints 12. Gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 12. Grid equals 1. Grid bag constraints 12. Insets equals new java.awt.insets 2, 10, 2, 5. Grid bag constraints 12. Weights equals 2.0d. Grid bag constraints 12. Grid width equals 3. Grid bag constraints 12. IPADX equals 0. Grid bag constraints 12. IPADI equals 0. JLabel 2. Set text. Grid bag constraints 13. Gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 13. Grid equals 5. Grid bag constraints 13. Fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 13. Weights equals 1.0d. Grid bag constraints 13. Insets equals new java.awt.insets 2, 10, 2, 5. Grid bag constraints 5. Anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 5. Fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 5. Weights equals 1.0d. Grid bag constraints 5. Insets equals new java.awt.insets 5, 10, 5, 10. Grid bag constraints 5. Grid width equals 3. Grid bag constraints 5. Gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 5. Grid equals 0. Grid bag constraints 14. Gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 14. Grid equals 6. Grid bag constraints 14. Anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 14. Fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.none. Grid bag constraints 14. Weights equals 1.0d. Grid bag constraints 14. Weight equals 0.2d. Grid bag constraints 14. Grid width equals 3. Grid bag constraints 14. Insets equals new java.awt.insets 2,10,2,10. JLabel5.set text. JLabel5.set preferred size, new java.awt.dimension, 1,16. JLabel5.set minimum size, new java.awt.dimension, 1,16. Grid bag constraints 15.weights equals 1.0. Grid bag constraints 15.weight equals 0.0 d. Grid bag constraints 15.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 15.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,10,5,10. Grid bag constraints 15.gridwidth equals 3. Grid bag constraints 15.gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 15.grid equals 2. Grid bag constraints 15.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 15.ipadx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 15.ipad equals 10. jpanel.add, get jpanel1, grid bag constraints 5. jpanel.add, jlabel1, grid bag constraints 12. jpanel.add, get jscrollpane, grid bag constraints 15. jpanel.add, get progressbar, grid bag constraints 11. jpanel.add, jlabel, grid bag constraints 4. jpanel.add, jlabel2, grid bag constraints 13. jpanel.add, get btunstart, grid bag constraints 2. jpanel.add, get btunstop, grid bag constraints 3. jpanel.add, jlabel5, grid bag constraints 14. Return jpanel. This method initializes text display. At return javax.swing.jText field. JLabel gets display. If text display equals null. Text display equals new JLabel, JLabel. Text display dots horizontal alignment, javax.swing.jText field left. Text display set alignments, 0.0f. Text display set preferred size, new java.awt.dimension, 350,30. Text display set editable, false. Text display set text, not started \r\n. Text display set minimum size, new java.awt.dimension, 350,30. Text display set maximum size, new java.awt.dimension, 350,30. Text display set vertical alignment, javax.swing.swingConstants.top. Return text display. This method initializes btn start. At return javax.swing.jButton. Private jButton get btunstart. If btn start equals null. btn start equals new jButton. btn start.set text, start. btn start.set minimum size, new java.awt.dimension, 75,30. btn start.set preferred size, new java.awt.dimension, 75,30. btn start.set maximum size, new java.awt.dimension, 100,40. btn start.add action listener, new java.awt.event.action listener. Public void action performed, java.awt.event.action event e. Extension.getView, .getSiteTreePanel, .getTreeSite, .removeTreeSelection listener, spider dialog. This. btn start.set enabled, false. btn stop.set enabled, true. Extension.start spider. Return btn start. This method initializes btn stop. At return javax.swing.jButton. Private jButton get btunstop. If btn stop equals null. btn stop equals new jButton. btn stop.set text, stop. btn stop.set maximum size, new java.awt.dimension, 100,40. btn stop.set minimum size, new java.awt.dimension, 70,30. btn stop.set preferred size, new java.awt.dimension, 70,30. btn stop.set enabled, false. btn stop.add action listener, new java.awt.event.action listener. Public void action performed, java.awt.event.action event e. btn stop.set enabled, false. Thread t equals new thread, new runnable. Public void run. If extension.getSpider equals null. Extension.getSpider.stop. Try. Event queue.invokeAndWait, new runnable. Public void run. btn start.set text, resume. btn start.set enabled, true. Catch, exception e. t.start. Extension.getSpider.stop. btn start.set text, resume. btn start.set enabled, true. Return btn stop. Void set plugin, extension spider plugin. This extension equals plugin. Plugin.getView, .getSideTreePanel, .getTreeSite, .addTreeSelection Listener, this method initializes progress bar. At return javax.swing.jProgressBar. jProgressBar get progress bar. If progress bar equals null. Progress bar equals new jProgressBar. Progress bar set string painted, true. Return progress bar. Public void value changed, javax.swing.event.treeSelection event e. jTreeSiteTree equals extension.getView, .getSideTreePanel, .getTreeSite. SiteNode equals, SiteNode, SiteTree.getLastSelected path component. Extension.setStartNode, node. If node.isRoot gets display, .set text, all sites will be crawled. Else. Try. http message equals node.getHistoryReference, .getHTP If message equals null. String tmp equals message get request header, .get URI, .toString. Gets display, .set text, tmp. Gets display, .set position, 0. Catch, exception e1. This method initializes jText field. At return javax.swing.jText field. JLabel gets numCrawled. If tsnumCrawled equals null. tsnumCrawled equals new JLabel. Return tsnumCrawled. This method initializes jText field 1. At return javax.swing.jText field. JLabel gets outstanding crawl. If tstoutstanding crawl equals null. tstoutstanding crawl equals new JLabel. Return tstoutstanding crawl. This method initializes jPanel1. At return javax.swing.jPanel. Private jPanel get jPanel1. If jPanel1 equals null. JLabel 4 equals new JLabel. JLabel 3 equals new JLabel. Gridbag constraints 6 equals new gridbag constraints. Gridbag constraints 7 equals new gridbag constraints. Gridbag constraints 8 equals new gridbag constraints. Gridbag constraints 9 equals new gridbag constraints. jPanel1 equals new jPanel. jPanel1.set layout, new gridbag layout. JLabel 3.set text, no crawled. JLabel 4.set text, no to crawl. Gridbag constraints 6.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 6.grid equals 0. Gridbag constraints 6.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 5,0,5,0. Gridbag constraints 6.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.west. Gridbag constraints 7.gridx equals 1. Gridbag constraints 7.grid equals 0. Gridbag constraints 7.weights equals 1.0. Grid bag constraints 7.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.none. Grid bag constraints 7.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 5,10,5,10. Grid bag constraints 7.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.center. Grid bag constraints 7.apadx equals 50. Grid bag constraints 8.gridx equals 2. Grid bag constraints 8.grid equals 0. Grid bag constraints 8.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 5,0,5,0. Grid bag constraints 8.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.west. Grid bag constraints 9.gridx equals 3. Grid bag constraints 9.grid equals 0. Grid bag constraints 9.weights equals 1.0. Grid bag constraints 9.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 9.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 5,10,5,10. Grid bag constraints 9.apadx equals 50. jpanel1.add, jlabel 3, grid bag constraints 6. jpanel1.add, gets numacrawled, grid bag constraints 7. jpanel1.add, jlabel 4, grid bag constraints 8. jpanel1.add, gets outstanding crawl, grid bag constraints 9. Return jpanel1. This method initializes jscrollPane. At return javax.swing.jscrollPane. Private jscrollPane get jscrollPane. If jscrollPane equals null. jscrollPane equals new jscrollPane. jscrollPane.horizontal scrollbar policy, javax.swing.jscrollPane.horizontal_scrollbar_never. jscrollPane.set vertical scrollbar policy, javax.swing.jscrollPane.vertical_scrollbar_never. jscrollPane.set preferred size, new java.awt.dimension, 035. jscrollPane.set viewport view, gets display. jscrollPane.set border, javax.swing.borderFactory.createEmpty border, 0,0,0,0. Return jscrollPane. At javdiclindex equals 0 visual constraint equals 10,10. Package org.parosproxy.paros.core.spider. Import org.apache.commons.client.uri. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.http message. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public Interface Spider Listener. Public Void Spider Progress, URI, int percentage complete, int number crawled, int number to crawl. Public Void Found URI, HTTP message, Boolean skip. Public Void Read URI, HTTP message. Public Void Spider complete. Package org.parosproxy.paros.extension.spider. Import java.awt.card layout. Import java.awt.eventQueue. Import java.awt.gridbagconstraints. Import java.awt.gridbaglayout. Import java.awt.event.inputEvent. Import javax.swing.jlabel. Import javax.swing.jpanel. Import javax.swing.jscrollPane. Import javax.swing.jsplitepane. Import javax.swing.jtextarea. Import org.parosproxy.paros.extension.abstractPanel. Import org.parosproxy.paros.view.view. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, code generation, code and comments. Public class spider panel extends abstract panel. Private J split pane equals null. Private J panel left panel equals null. Private J panel right panel equals null. Private J label equals null. Private J text area texture found equals null. Private J scroll pane equals null. Private J label 1 equals null. Private J text area texture skip equals null. Private J scroll pane 1 equals null. Public spider panel. Super. Initialize. This method initializes this. At return void. Private void initialize. This dot set layout, new card layout. This dot set size, 700, 214. This dot set name, spider. This dot add, get split pane, dot get name. This method initializes split pane. At return javax.swing.j split pane. Private J split pane get split pane. If split pane equals null. Split pane equals new J split pane. Split pane dot set name, split pane. Split pane dot set divider size, 3. Split pane dot set divider location, 120. Split pane dot set orientation, javax.swing.j split pane vertical _ split. Split pane dot set top component, get left panel. Split pane dot set bottom component, get right panel. Split pane dot str size weight, 0.5d. Return split pane. This method initializes left panel. At return javax.swing.j panel. Private J panel get left panel. If left panel equals null. J label equals new J label. Grid bag constraints 1 equals new grid bag constraints. Grid bag constraints 2 equals new grid bag constraints. Left panel equals new J panel. Left panel dot set layout, new grid bag layout. J label dot set text, URI found during crawl. Grid bag constraints 1 dot gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 1 dot grid equals 0. Grid bag constraints 1 dot insets equals new java dot awt dot insets, 2,2,2,2. Grid bag constraints 1 dot anchor equals java dot awt dot grid bag constraints dot northwest. Grid bag constraints 1 dot fill equals java dot awt dot grid bag constraints dot horizontal. Grid bag constraints 1 dot weights equals 1.0d. Grid bag constraints 2 dot gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 2 dot grid equals 1. Grid bag constraints 2 dot weights equals 1.0. Grid bag constraints 2 dot weighty equals 1.0. Grid bag constraints 2 dot fill equals java dot awt dot grid bag constraints dot both. Grid bag constraints 2 dot insets equals new java dot awt dot insets, 0,2,0,2. Grid bag constraints 2 dot anchor equals java dot awt dot grid bag constraints dot northwest. Left panel dot add, J label, grid bag constraints 1. Left panel dot add, get J scroll pane, grid bag constraints 2. Return left panel. This method initializes right panel. At return javax.swing.j panel. Private J panel get right panel. If right panel equals null. J label 1 equals new J label. Grid bag constraints 3 equals new grid bag constraints. Grid bag constraints 4 equals new grid bag constraints. Right panel equals new J panel. Right panel dot set layout, new grid bag layout. J label 1 dot set text, URI found but out of crawl scope. Grid bag constraints 3 dot gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 3 dot grid equals 0. Grid bag constraints 3 dot insets equals new java dot awt dot insets, 2,2,2,2. Grid bag constraints 3 dot fill equals java dot awt dot grid bag constraints dot horizontal. Grid bag constraints 3. Anchor equals java.awt. Grid bag constraints. Northwest. Grid bag constraints 3. Weights equals 1.0 d. Grid bag constraints 4. Gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 4. Gride equals 1. Grid bag constraints 4. Weights equals 1.0. Grid bag constraints 4. Weight equals 1.0. Grid bag constraints 4. Fill equals java.awt. Grid bag constraints. Both. Grid bag constraints 4. Insets equals new java.awt. Insets 0,2,0,2. Grid bag constraints 4. Anchor equals java.awt. Grid bag constraints. Northwest. Grid bag constraints 4. iPad equals 24. Right panel. Add JLabel 1. Grid bag constraints 3. Right panel. Add get JScrollPane 1. Grid bag constraints 4. Return right panel. This method initializes tStorySkip. At return javax.swing.jTextArea. JTextArea gets found. If tStoryFound equals null. tStoryFound equals new JTextArea. tStoryFound.setFont, new java.awt.font, dialog, java.awt.font.plain, 11. tStoryFound.setEditable, false. tStoryFound.setLineWrap, true. tStoryFound.addMoListener, new java.awt.event.mouseAdapter. Public void mouse pressed, java.awt.event.mouseEvent e. If e.get modifiers, and input event.button 3 _ equals 0, right mouse button. View.get singleton, .get pop-up menu, .show, e.get component, e.get x, e.get y. Return tStoryFound. This method initializes JScrollPane. At return javax.swing.jscrollPane. Private JScrollPane get JScrollPane. If JScrollPane equals null. JScrollPane equals new JScrollPane. JScrollPane.setViewPortView, gets found. JScrollPane.setFont, new java.awt.font, dialog, java.awt.font.plain, 11. JScrollPane.horizontal scrollbar policy, javax.swing.jscrollPane.horizontal_scrollbar_never. Return JScrollPane. This method initializes tStorySkip. At return javax.swing.jTextArea. JTextArea gets StorySkip. If tStorySkip equals null. tStorySkip equals new JTextArea. tStorySkip.setEditable, false. tStorySkip.setFont, new java.awt.font, dialog, java.awt.font.plain, 11. tStorySkip.setLineWrap, true. tStorySkip.addMoListener, new java.awt.event.mouseAdapter. Public void mouse pressed, java.awt.event.mouseEvent e. If e.get modifiers, and input event.button 3 _ equals 0, right mouse button. View.get singleton, .get pop-up menu, .show, e.get component, e.get x, e.get y. Return tStorySkip. This method initializes JScrollPane 1. At return javax.swing.jscrollPane. Private JScrollPane get JScrollPane 1. If JScrollPane 1 equals null. JScrollPane 1 equals new JScrollPane. JScrollPane 1.setViewPortView, gets StorySkip. JScrollPane 1.horizontal scrollbar policy, javax.swing.jscrollPane.horizontal_scrollbar_never. Return JScrollPane 1. Void append found, final string s. If eventQ.isDispatch thread gets found, .append, s. Return. Try. EventQ.invokeAndWait, new runnable. Public void run. Gets found, dot append, s. Catch, exception e. Void append found but skip, final string s. If, event q.is dispatch thread. Gets to reskip, dot append, s. Return. Try. Event q.invoke and wait, new runnable. Public void run. Gets to reskip, dot append, s. Catch, exception e. Void clear. Gets to found, dot set text. Gets to reskip, dot set text. At javedical index equals 0 visual constraint equals 10,10. Package org.paros proxy.paros.core.spider. Import java.utility vector. Import java.utility regex.pattern. Import org.apache.commons.client.uri. Import org.paros proxy.paros.common.abstract param. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class spider param extends abstract param. Private static final string spider equals spider. Private static final string spider underscore max underscore depth equals spider dot max depth. Private static final string spider underscore thread equals spider dot thread. Private static final string spider underscore scope equals spider dot scope. Private static final string spider underscore post underscore form equals spider dot post form. Private static final string spider underscore skip underscore URL equals spider dot skipURL. Private int max depth equals 5. Private int thread equals 2. Private string scope equals. Private int post form equals 0. Private string skip URL equals. Private pattern skipURL equals null. Private pattern scope equals null. At param root element name. Public spider param. Non-javadoc. At ccom proof secure.paros.common.file xml number parse. Protected void parse. Try. Set thread, get config, .get int, spider underscore thread, 2. Catch, exception e. Try. Set max depth, get config, .get int, spider underscore max underscore depth, 5. Catch, exception e. Try. Set post form, get config, .get int, spider underscore post underscore form, 0, equals 0. Catch, exception e. Set scope, get config, .get string, spider underscore scope. Set skipURL, get config, .get string, spider underscore skip underscore URL. At return returns the max depth. Public int get max depth. Return max depth. At param max depth the max depth to set. Public void set max depth, int max depth. This dot max depth equals max depth. Get config, set property, spider underscore max underscore depth, integer dot toString, this dot max depth. At return returns the scope. Public string get scope. Return scope. At param scope the scope to set. Public void set scope, string scope. This dot scope equals scope. Get config, set property, spider underscore scope, this dot scope. Parse scope, this dot scope. At return returns the thread. Public int get thread. Return thread. At param thread the thread to set. Public void set thread, int thread. This dot thread equals thread. Get config, set property, spider underscore thread, integer dot toString, this dot thread. Check if given host name need to send using proxy. At param host name to be checked. At return true equals need to send via proxy. Public boolean isn scope, string host name. If pattern scope equals null, host name equals null. Return false. Return pattern scope dot matcher, host name, dot find. Parse the proxy chain, skip text string and build the regex pattern. Private void parse scope, string scope. Pattern scope equals null. If scope equals null, scope dot equals. Return. Scope equals scope dot replace all, backslash dot, backslash dot. Scope equals scope dot replace all, backslash dot. Replace all, plus dollar, plus. Scope equals, plus scope dot replace all, plus dollar. Pattern scope equals pattern dot compile, scope, pattern dot case underscore insensitive. Public boolean is post form. Return, post form, equals 0. Public void set post form, boolean post form. If, post form. This dot post form equals 1. Else. This dot post form equals 0. Get config, dot set property, spider underscore post underscore form, integer dot tossed ring, this dot post form. Public void set skipURL, string skip URL. This dot skip URL equals skip URL. Get config, dot set property, spider underscore skip underscore URL, this dot skip URL. Parse skipURL, this dot skip URL. Public boolean is skipURL, URI. If, pattern skipURL equals null, URI equals null. Return false. String suri equals URI dot tossed ring. Return pattern skipURL dot matcher, suri, dot find. Private void parse skipURL, string skip URL. Pattern skipURL equals null. If, skip URL equals null, skip URL dot equals. Return. Skip URL equals skip URL dot replace all, backslash dot, backslash dot. Skip URL equals skip URL dot replace all, backslash dot. Replace all, backslash s plus sign dollar sign, backslash s plus. Skip URL equals backslash a left parenthesis plus skip URL dot replace all, backslash s plus. Pattern skipURL equals pattern dot compile, skip URL, pattern dot case underscore insensitive pattern dot multiline. Public string get skipURL. Return skip URL. Package org.paros proxy.paros.core.spider. Import java.io exception. Import java.utility list. Import org.apache.commons.client.http exception. Import org.apache.commons.client.uri. Import org.apache.commons.client.uri exception. Import org.paros proxy.paros.network.http header. Import org.paros proxy.paros.network.http malformed header exception. Import org.paros proxy.paros.network.http message. Import org.paros proxy.paros.network.http response header. Import org.paros proxy.paros.network.http status code. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class spider thread extends thread. Private static final string neglect underscore suffixes equals GIF, JPG, BMP, MP3, ARG, DOC, SWF, PDF, MPG, WMV, ZIP, EXE, CAB, ISO, AVI. Private spider parent equals null. Private boolean stop equals false. Private list queue equals null. Private boolean completed equals false. Private collector equals null. Private boolean empty queue equals false. At return returns the empty queue. Boolean isempty queue. Return empty queue. Spider thread, spider parent. This dot parent equals parent. Queue equals parent dot get queue. Collector equals new collector, this. This dot set daemon, true. This dot set priority, thread dot norm underscore priority 2. At return returns the stop. Boolean is stop. Return stop. At param stop the stop to set. Void set stop, boolean stop. This dot stop equals stop. Public void run. Queue item equals null. While is stop, and queue dot is empty. To avoid one thread running but other thread exit. While is stop, and parent dot isal thread empty queue. Try. Synchronized, queue. Get distinct item from queue. 2. Item equals null. If queue dot is empty. Try. See tempty queue, true. Thread dot sleep, 500. Catch, interrupted exception i.e. else. Item equals, queue item, queue dot remove, 0. See tempty queue, false. While, stop and end item, equals null and end parent dot isen visited link, item dot get message. If, item, equals null. Parent dot spider progress, item. Crawl, item dot get message, item dot get depth. Item dot get history reference, dot delete. Try. Thread dot sleep, 30. Catch, interrupted exception e1. Else if, stop. No item, waiting for all spider queue empty. Try. Thread dot sleep, 500. Catch, interrupted exception e1. Catch, exception e dot print stack trace. If queue dot is empty. Completed equals true. Parent dot check a full thread completed. Private void readms response, HTTP message, throws HTTP exception, IO exception, HTTP malformed header exception. Message get request header, dot seth eater, HTTP header dot if underscore modified underscore since, null. Message get request header, dot seth eater, HTTP header dot if underscore none underscore match, null. Message get request header, dot set content length, message get request body, dot length. Parent dot get sender, dot send and receive, message. Message get response a header, dot seth eater, HTTP header dot transfer underscore encoding, null. Private void crawl, HTTP message, int depth. HTML equals null. Try. If, is neglect crawl, message. Parent dot read URI, message. Return. Readms response, message. If, message get response a header, dot is empty, message get response a header, dot get status code, equals HTTP status code dot not underscore modified. If, readms response, message. Return. If, HTTP status code dot is success, message get response a header, dot get status code. Return. If, message get response a header, dot get content length, 200,000. Message response a header, new HTTP response header. Message get response body, dot set body. Parent dot read URI, message. If, is neglect response, message get response a header. Return. HTML equals new HTML, message get request header, dot get URI, message get response body, dot toString. Collector dot collect, HTML, depth. No more response processing needed. Remove from message to save memory. Catch, exception e dot print stack trace. Finally. Message response a header, new HTTP response header. Message get response body, .set body. Parent.add visited link, message. Build URI given a base HTML. Keep absolute if it is. At param HTML. At param link. At return. At throws URI exception. Private URI build URI, URI base, string link, throws URI exception. URI equals null. Try. URI equals new URI, link, true. If, URI.isubsoluturi. Return URI. Catch, URI exception e. URI equals new URI, base, link, true. Return URI. Void found URI, HTTP message, string referrer, int current depth, throws URI exception. Message get request header, .sethEater, HTTP header.referrer, referrer. Parent.found URI, message, current depth +1. Private boolean is neglect crawl, HTTP message. Boolean result equals false. URI equals message get request header, .get URI. Try. Check if need to skip this URL from config. If, parent.get spider param, .skipperl, URI. Return true. Check if suffix relevant. If, URI.get path, equals null. String path equals URI.get path, .to lowercase. 4. Int I equals 0, I neglect underscore suffixes length, I++. String suffix equals dot. Plus neglect underscore suffixes I. If, path ends with, suffix. Return true. Catch, exception e. Return result. Private boolean is neglect response, HTTP response header resheader. If, HTTP status code is success, resheader.get status code. Return true. If, resheader.is image. Return true. If, resheader.is text. Return false. Do not process, not HTML file. If, resheader.get content length, 200,000. Return true. Return false. At return returns the completed. Public boolean is completed. Return completed. At param empty queue the empty queue to set. Private void ctemp boolean empty queue. This empty queue equals empty queue. Spider get parent. Return parent. Package org.paros proxy.paros.network. Import java.io.file. Import java.io.file input stream. Import java.io.io exception. Import java.net.inet address. Import java.net.server socket. Import java.net.socket. Import java.net.unknown host exception. Import java.security.keystor. Import javax.net.server socket factory. Import javax.net.ssl.hpserl connection. Import javax.net.ssl.keymanager. Import javax.net.ssl.keymanager factory. Import javax.net.ssl.ssl context. Import javax.net.ssl.server socket factory. Import javax.net.ssl.ssl socket. Import javax.net.ssl.socket factory. Import javax.net.ssl.trust manager. Import javax.net.ssl.x509 trust manager. Import org.apache.commons.client.connect timeout exception. Import org.apache.commons.params.http connection params. Import org.apache.commons.client.protocol.controller thread socket factory. Import org.apache.commons.client.protocol.reflection socket factory. Import org.apache.commons.client.protocol.secure protocol socket factory. Public class SSL connector implements secure protocol socket factory. Private static final string CRLF equals \r\n. Private static final string SSL equals SSL. Client socket factories. Private static SL socket factory client slow sock factory equals null. Private static SL socket factory client slow sock cert factory equals null. Server related socket factories. Private static server socket factory servers is sock factory equals null. Private static SL socket factory tunnels is L factory equals null. Public SSL connector. If client slow sock factory equals null. Client slow sock factory equals get client socket factory SSL. If servers is sock factory equals null. Servers is sock factory equals get server socket factory SSL. Public SSL socket client string host name int host port boolean use client cert throws IO exception. SSL socket equals null. Socket equals client no handshake host name host port use client cert. Socket.start handshake. Return socket. Public SSL socket client no handshake string host name int host port boolean use client cert throws IO exception. SSL socket equals null. If use client cert. Socket equals SSL socket client slow sock cert factory dot create socket host name host port. Else socket equals SSL socket client slow sock factory dot create socket host name host port. Return socket. Public SSL socket client via proxy string host name int host port string proxy name int proxy port boolean use client cert throws IO exception. SSL socket equals client via proxy no handshake host name host port proxy name proxy port use client cert. Socket.start handshake. Return socket. Public SSL socket client via proxy no handshake string host name int host port string proxy name int proxy port boolean use client cert throws IO exception. HTTP response header res equals new HTTP response header. Socket tunnel equals establish tunnel host name host port proxy name proxy port res. If tunnel equals null. Return null. SSL socket equals null. If use client cert. Socket equals SSL socket client slow sock cert factory dot create socket tunnel host name host port true. Else socket equals SSL socket client slow sock factory dot create socket tunnel host name host port true. Return socket. Public void set client cert file key file char passphrase throws exception. Set up a key manager for client authentication. If asked by the server, use the implementations. Default trust store and secure random routines. Client slow sock cert factory equals null. Key manager key mgr equals null. Trust manager trust mgr equals new relaxed x509 trust manager, trust all invalid server certificate. SSL context CTX. Key manager factory KMF. Keys tor KS. CTX equals SSL context dot get instance, SSL. KMF equals key manager factory dot get instance, sun x509. KS equals keys tor dot get instance, JKS. KS equals keys tor dot get instance, PKCS12. KS.load, new file input stream, key file, passphrase. Java.security.secure random x equals new java.security.secure random. X.set seed, system.current to me millis. KMF.init, KS, passphrase. CTX.init, kmf.getManagers, trust mgr, x. Client slow sock cert factory equals ctx.getSocket factory. Public void seatenable client cert, boolean enabled. If enabled. Client slow sock factory equals client slow sock cert factory. Else. Client slow sock factory equals get client socket factory, SSL. Public socket establish tunnel, string host name, int host port, string proxy name, int proxy port, HTTP response header res, throws IO exception. Socket tunnel equals new socket, proxy name, proxy port. HTTP input stream tunnel underscore in equals new HTTP input stream, tunnel.get input stream. HTTP output stream tunnel underscore out equals new HTTP output stream, tunnel.get output stream. HTTP request header REQ equals new HTTP request header, get connect string, host name, host port. Tunnel underscore out dot write, REQ. Tunnel underscore out dot flush. HTTP response header tunnel res equals, HTTP response header, tunnel underscore in dot read header. Res dot set message, tunnel res dot tossed ring. If, res dot ismal format header, res dot get status code, equals HTTP status code dot OK. Return null. Return tunnel. Public server socket listen, int port number, throws IO exception. Server socket sl server port equals null. Sl server port equals servers is sock factory dot create server socket, port number. Return sl server port. Public server socket listen, throws IO exception. Server socket sl server port equals null. Sl server port equals servers is sock factory dot create server socket. Return sl server port. Public server socket listen, int port number, int max connection, throws IO exception. Server socket sl server port equals null. Sl server port equals servers is sock factory dot create server socket, port number, max connection. Return sl server port. Public server socket listen, int param portnum, int max connection, inet address IP, throws IO exception. Server socket sl server port equals servers is sock factory dot create server socket, param portnum, max connection, IP. Return sl server port. Public sl socket factory get client socket factory, string type. Keymanager key mgr equals null. Trust manager trust mgr equals new trust manager new relaxed x509 trust manager, trust all invalid server certificate. Try. SSL context equals SSL context dot get instance, type. Java.security.secure random x equals new java.security.secure random. X.set seed, system.current to me millis. SSL context.init, null, trust mgr, x. Client slow sock factory equals SSL context.get socket factory. Hpsrl connection.set default slow socket factory, client slow sock factory. Catch, exception e.print stack trace. Return client slow sock factory. Public server socket factory get server socket factory, string type. If, type dot equals, SSL, type dot equals, SSL v3. Sl server socket factory SSF equals null. Try. Set up key manager to do server authentication. SSL context CTX. Key manager factory KMF. Keys tor KS. Char passphrase equals, at number $% and, dot tokerere. CTX equals SSL context dot get instance, type. KMF equals key manager factory dot get instance, sun x509. KS equals keys tor dot get instance, JKS. Java.security.secure random x equals new java.security.secure random. X.set seed, system.current to me millis. KS.load, new file input stream, paros key, passphrase. KS.load, this.get class, .get class loader, kmf.getRes C stream, resource Baroski, passphrase. kmf.init, ks, passphrase. ctx.init, kmf.getManagers, null, x. ssf equals ctx.getServer socket factory. Tunnels is L factory equals ctx.getSocket factory. Return ssf. Catch, exception e.print stack trace. Else. Return server socket factory.get default. Return null. Private static string get connect string, string host name, int host port. String buffer sb equals new string buffer, 200. sb append, connect plus host name plus colon plus host port plus http 1.0 plus crlf. sb append, user agent, Mozilla 4.0, compatible, MSIE 6.0, Windows NT 5.0 plus crlf. sb append, host, plus host name plus colon plus host port and crlf. sb append, pragma, no cache plus crlf. sb append, content length, 0 plus crlf. sb append, crlf. Return sb to string. At C secure protocol socket factory number create socket, java.lang.string int java.net.inet address int. Public socket create socket. String host. Int port. inet address client host. Int client port. Throws IO exception, unknown host exception. Socket equals client slowsock factory.create socket. Host. Port. Client host. Client port. Return socket. Attempts to get a new socket connection to the given host within the given time limit. P. This method employs several techniques to circumvent the limitations of older DRES that do not support connect timeout. When running in JRE 1.4 or above, reflection is used to call socket number connect, socket address endpoint, int timeout, method. When executing in older DRES, a controller thread is executed. The controller thread attempts to create a new socket within the given limit of time. If socket constructor does not return until the timeout expires, the controller terminates and throws an @link connect timeout exception. P. @param host the host name IP. @param port the port on the host. @param client host the local host name IP to bind the socket to. @param client port the port on the local machine. @params @link HTTP connection params HTTP connection parameters. @return socket a new socket. @throws IO exception if an IO error occurs while creating the socket. @throws unknown host exception if the IP address of the host cannot be determined. Public socket create socket. Final string host. Final int port. Final inet address local address. Final int local port. Final HTTP connection params. Throws IO exception, unknown host exception, connect timeout exception. If params equals null. Throw new illegal argument exception, parameters may not be null. Int timeout equals params.get connection timeout. If timeout equals 0. Return create socket, host, port, local address, local port. Else. To be eventually deprecated when migrated to Java 1.4 or above. Socket equals reflection socket factory.create socket. javax.net.ssl.sl socket factory, host, port, local address, local port, timeout. If socket equals null. Socket equals controller thread socket factory.create socket. This host, port, local address, local port, timeout. Return socket. At C secure protocol socket factory number create socket, java.lang.string int. Public socket create socket, string host, int port. Throws IO exception, unknown host exception. Return client slow sock factory. Create socket. Host. Port. At C secure protocol socket factory number create socket, java.net.socket java.lang.string int boolean. Public socket create socket. Socket. String host. Int port. Boolean auto close. Throws IO exception, unknown host exception. Return client slow sock factory. Create socket. Socket. Host. Port. Auto close. Create a SSL socket using an existing connected socket. It can be used such as a tunneled SSL proxy socket, e.g. when a connect request is received. This SSL socket will start server-side handshake immediately. At param socket. At return. At throws IO exception. Public socket create a tunnel server socket, socket, throws IO exception. SSL socket S equals, SSL socket, tunnels is L factory. Create socket, socket.get init address, .gethist address, socket.get port, true. S.C2C client mode, false. S.start handshake. Return S. Class relaxed X509 Trust Manager implements X509 Trust Manager. Public Boolean check client trusted, java.security.cert.x509 certificate chain. Return true. Public Boolean eServer trusted, java.security.cert.x509 certificate chain. Return true. Public Boolean isClient trusted, java.security.cert.x509 certificate chain. Return true. Public java.security.cert.x509 certificate get accepted isers. Return null. Public void check client trusted, java.security.cert.x509 certificate chain, string auth type. Public void check server trusted, java.security.cert.x509 certificate chain, string auth type.